Super Smash Bros., everyone's favorite series about killing Pichu. Starting out as a quaint little fighting game franchise crossing over a selection of Nintendo universes, this series has become a titan the likes of which has rarely ever been seen. Crazy modes, an insane character roster, and a level of detail far beyond anything of its kind, Super Smash Bros. Is a beast of a series. Now, I personally have been with this series most of my life, from having to be convinced to play it by being told it has Mario in it, all the way to watching the final character of Ultimate's DLC being revealed live. I don't think that there's another series that has consistently taken over my life like Super Smash Bros. Has. Like, being real, this series had me speculating about the meaning of the shape of some clouds, or whether the background in Smash Directs hinted at something like a very normal, well-adjusted individual, and I think that speaks volumes about how impactful this series is. It kind of feels like I got to watch the series grow up with me, all the ups and downs and all arounds that come with it. Now, I've always wanted to sit down and take a look at this series as a whole, analyzing its progression over time and reliving my childhood memories growing up with it. Again, I love this series, and so I wanted to give it some love for years, and yet it's taken me this long to do that. Why? Well, there's always been a bit of a problem. Something that always stops me from fully starting. Something that, in all respects, should be easy to get over with, and yet I've never been able to muster up the ability to deal with it. And that problem is Super Smash Bros. Not the series, like the first game. Of all the games in the series, Smash 64 is an odd one for me. No matter how much I tried in the past, I could never muster up any enthusiasm for it. Was it because I didn't like the game? No, it's pretty fun. It's still a Smash game at the end of the day, so it's not like it's gonna be bad or anything. It's just, I don't know, there's just something so uninteresting about talking about it. And I don't just mean on my end either. While most of the Smash games still remain somewhat relevant and discussed to this day, I never see the same for 64. When it is mentioned, it's just like, hey wow guys, it's the first one. That's the end of the discussion. Outside of some occasional nostalgia for it, it seems like no one really cares about 64 anymore. Almost like as time's gone on, it's completely faded from relevance in a way I don't usually see with Nintendo games. And while it took me a long time to understand why this was the case for an entry that should, in all respects, still be held in high regard, I think I figured out why this has happened. Why Super Smash Bros. 64, despite being the originator of a juggernaut, is all but irrelevant all these years later. So that being said, it's time to start off my multi-video retrospective series with Super Smash Bros. 64. Way back in 1998, there was an at-the-time little-known developer by the name of Masahiro Sakurai working at a developer famous for a wad of gum named HAL Laboratories. He'd gotten his start developing some little obscure series that you probably had never heard of, and while he had a couple games under his belt, he wanted to try his hand at something a little different from the typical platformer. What he came up with was Dragon King, a fighting game that leaned far more heavily on platforming than just pure combos. And while the gameplay seemed promising, the game would probably be a pretty hard sell, and not just because of the Pepsi Man ripoffs the game had as fighters. While fighting games were absurdly popular in the early 90s, by this point the market had one too many Primal King of Street Combat Fury Mega Hyper Turbo Beach Volleyball editions, and so people weren't really buying them anymore. No, this game would need something to help sell it. And so, like a lot of people at Nintendo probably do when they don't think a game will sell, they ask themselves an important question. What if we just put Mario in it? And so he developed it in secret before presenting the demo to Nintendo higher-ups, showing Mario, Donkey Kong, Samus, and Fox beating the tar out of each other. So, what do you think? Can we beat up a little yellow rat too? Yeah, I guess we could, but— Sold! And so, Super Smash Bros. Started development on a budget of 2 rubber bands and a wet piece of salami, eventually releasing on January 21st, 1999 in Japan, and later seeing a worldwide release, featuring a freaking hilarious ad campaign that instantly got people excited for the concept. Again, people just really want to beat up yellow rats, I guess. Now, Super Smash Bros. Would have mechanics that were incredibly different for a fighting game at the time. Instead of having a litany of button combos to learn, Smash had 1 button for basic attacks and 1 button for specials, with the direction of the stick determining what special is used. No more quarter circle A, quarter circle B, and a flip in real life and then recount the alphabet backwards just to throw a fireball. You just press B. And while the game also featured other typical fighting game commands like a grab, a block, a dodge, all that good stuff, the goal of the game was different here. Damaging enemies didn't take chunks off their health bar, but instead raised their percentage, and the higher that went, the further an opponent would be launched by an attack, the end goal being to fling your opponent off the stage. There was also an increased emphasis on aerial maneuvers and platforming, and these elements would all combine to create the platform fighter. Now, technically, this wasn't the debut of the platform fighter, as that technically started with the Outfoxies, a 1995 arcade game that sadly, no, did not feature the famous FNAF character guy, but Super Smash Bros. Popularized it, and still is the most popular series in the genre to this day. Now, no matter what else I say in this video about this game, even despite any of the N64 Clunk present here, this formula just works. I honestly don't like regular fighting games. This stuff is like kryptonite to me. I break out in hives just looking at this shit. But Smash is different. The mechanics are simple to get a handle on, but they also provide the game a finesse and a flow that's wholly unique to it. It's just so much more chaotic and all over the place. You're constantly moving and jumping around, dodging out of the way of attacks, getting bounced off of walls, hitting bombs, over and over. And the feel of the attacks is next level here, with moves having these crunchy sound effects associated with them. Like, sure, you can pull off a cool combo in these games or whatever, but in my book, nothing is as satisfying as jumping off the side of the stage, slamming the opponent, and watching them spike to the bottom in an instant. At a fundamental level, this system is just inherently fun. It's got all the crunch of a regular fighting game, but it's combined with mechanics and elements that make the game far more exciting to experience, while also keeping things simple enough that anyone can play it. But all the quality mechanics in the world wouldn't mean anything if this game didn't have the roster to sell it. Super Smash Bros. Was billed as a crossover between Nintendo's biggest universes, and while that isn't always necessarily the case with some of these, it certainly is for the starting roster. The game starts out with 8 characters, each of which being a representative of one of Nintendo's star series during the 80s and 90s. Except this guy, I'm not sure who he is, but he looks pretty cool, so I'm glad he's here. Nah, but seriously, Mario is such an obvious choice. He's the video game character. Everyone knows him, everyone loves him, and he's Nintendo's mascot, so not including him would have been pretty dumb. Also, from a design perspective, Mario is super smart as well. Even if you don't know anyone else on this roster, you'll know Mario, and his mechanics are designed as a basic crash course on how the game works without any complications. Punches, kicks, a straightforward projectile, a straightforward recovery, he's designed to be simple to adjust to, which is a smart move. And considering they debuted at the same time, it only makes sense that the second character would be Donkey Kong. While his arcade days had long since passed, the character was brought back and reimagined with the Donkey Kong Country series, which blew minds back in the 90s for its mind-blowing graphics. Mind-blowing graphics. He's bigger, slower, and kinda strong, but honestly, he feels like the worst character because he's kinda too big. Next up was Link, the star of the Legend of Zelda series, which yeah, he was gonna be included. Zelda was Nintendo's second big series behind Mario, so he was a sure pick. He's also got a simple design like Mario, showing a lot of the basics of a weapons-based fighting style with fairly simple to grasp mechanics. He's also probably my main in the roster, for whatever that's worth. I like his upbeat. Next up is Samus, the armor-clad star of the Metroid series. It was never quite as big as Mario or Zelda, but it was another one of the big boys of the NES and SNES eras. And then there's Yoshi. He's lame. I'm sorry, I don't like this character, okay? I get why he's here, but I don't like him. He just bothers me. Kirby was another big franchise at the time too, having a litany of mainline games and spin-offs to his name. And this was HAL, the developers of Kirby. Of course he was gonna be in it. Now, I'm not sure why the intro positions the pink wad of gum as Mario's rival, but I guess he's happy to be here, so you know what? I'm glad for him. Fox McCloud was the star of the Star Fox series, featuring a mind-blower of a Super Nintendo game and Star Fox 64, which were all pretty big hits, so it makes sense to have him here. Though it's kind of funny that his games are all about, flying in a ship, and here he is just kind of never using it. A little weird, but okay. And then there's Pikachu. He's dead. Pikachu. Pokemon. Do I need to say any more? I mean, as far as a roster goes, you can't get much more star power than this. It's a collection of Nintendo's biggest and baddest franchises, and it means that right out the gate, the roster had a ton of appeal. It was likely that if you were a fan of Nintendo at the time, you were bound to be attached to at least one of these characters. And even for the ones you didn't know, it showed you a little bit about the character in the series they were from, placing them in your mind. I wonder if there's any benefits to that. Well, anyways, while these are definitely logical choices, I'd argue it's with the unlockable characters that we started to see what made Smash so much more interesting than other fighters. I mean, most companies, if they had more roster slots, they'd just cram it full of massive characters to make the game sell better. But you see, that's where Smash sets itself apart. Ness was the star of the cult classic Earthbound, a game that, while somewhat popular in Japan, bombed overseas, meaning that very few people who played Smash at the time even knew who this weird kid was. But the thing is, Earthbound was a cult classic for a reason, and not only did this likely please the few fans of Earthbound that did exist at the time, but it also introduced a lot of people to what was a fairly obscure piece of Nintendo history, myself included. Captain Falcon is in a similar boat. While the series he's from, F-Zero, was a little popular at the time, the character himself was not, and I doubt anyone would specifically ask for him if he wasn't included. But they did include him anyways, giving the character this extreme, over-the-top persona befitting of his games, and also giving him the single attack that would define his entire legacy. These characters are such odd choices in retrospect, but I think that's why they work so well. Part of the fun of a crossover like this is seeing everything, both popular and obscure, all under one roof. It's like, look at my boy Ness here next to all these obscure indie characters, I love it. Like, let's be real, in another universe or under any other company, these characters would have been replaced by, like, Bowser and Charizard. But these choices showed that Sakurai was focused on representing all of Nintendo history, not just the popular stuff. And that would set a precedent going forward. Now, the other two characters were a little closer to what I just described, that being additional characters from popular franchises. But I'd argue that, even then, they sort of point to the future of Smash as a whole. First up was Luigi, essentially the first clone in the series, reusing Mario's model and moves, but reskinning it as a different character, which honestly, I kinda like. It's a smart way to use assets, and Luigi here is presented with way more personality than he ever was previously, looking like this clumsy goof with barely a hold on what he's doing, literally pushing people away with his attacks like he doesn't even want to fight. And Jigglypuff might just be our first joke character, a trend that would become incredibly common as the series went on. She's this bizarre balloon that dies to almost anything, but also confusingly has a move that's basically insta-death, whether that be for the character you're using it on, or Jigglypuff herself. It's a roster that manages to keep a balance between a star-studded cast and just enough weird shit to make things way more exciting than they could have been, and I'm impressed with how it turned out despite its size. Like, with the budget they had, I don't think they really could have done any better than this. Though, mentioning that budget, while it certainly seemed to have an effect on the amount of characters we got, it seems like it may have seeped into a lot more than just that. Because while everything I've talked about so far rings true as genuine praise for 64, there's a lot of stuff underneath that rarely gets discussed. Stuff that gnaws away at the core of what makes this concept satisfying to begin with. So Super Smash Bros. 64 was made, surprise surprise, for the Nintendo 64. Being that this was Nintendo's first 3D console, a lot of the games looked very unique. And being that Smash was developed on such a cheap budget, it meant that these high quality visuals from these other games were still a little too much. What we have instead are models that look rather questionable at best. I'm talking to you, Triangle Head Donkey Kong. Like, compare Smash Mario to Mario Tennis Mario, or Donkey Kong to Donkey Kong 64, or Samus to Wowee. And this carries through to pretty much every aspect of the visual design. This general lack of polish that kinda makes the game feel cheap. Menus are static and boring, with backgrounds that I swear almost look like the game is trying to pull up a corrupted image. Classic mode victory images are just stolen renders of characters, sometimes ones that don't even match with the background. The stages are blurry and low poly, and sometimes I can't even tell what the heck I'm looking at. Like, where is this supposed to be in Zelda? It just looks like a generic unpolished castle. And what is this? Like, seriously, what is this? It's a bunch of floating nothing. What does this have to do with Mario? The stages in 64 always reminded me more of cheap plastic playsets than actual locations. They vaguely look like they could be associated with something, but equally they look like they could have just been generic placeholder stages they later attached to a franchise. And all of these things leave the presentation feeling cheap and unfinished. Though, I guess part of it may have been intentional, as during development the goal was to get the game to a consistent 60 FPS, which is admirable. Still doesn't change the fact that the game looks like butt cheeks. Though visual Clunk is kinda just an N64 thing. Like, besides, I don't know, Paper Mario, almost every game on the system looks a little rough, so it's not that big of a deal. However, what is a big deal is that the Clunk doesn't just extend to the visuals. So if you go back to 64 after playing literally any other game in this series, there's something you're bound to notice right away, and it's that this game does not feel good to play. Movement just feels off, like everything you do has too much delay, or like you're not completely in control of your character. Like trying to latch onto an edge, for example. In later games, it's a snap, as natural as riding a bike, but here it always feels like there's a chance the character just won't do it. And that kind of feeling applies to everything here. Attacks just feel so sluggish half the time, like you put in the input and the character takes an eternity to complete the animation. Specials have this habit of just stopping you in your tracks for so long that it almost feels like a pain to use them. Like, oh no, it's so fun to chill for 2 seconds while Link throws his boomerang, how fun. This is one of those things where it's hard to demonstrate it through just footage, but trust me, play one of the later games and then try to play this one and it'll feel like you're playing with a controller covered in syrup. And this Clunk really affects how much I can enjoy this game. Like again, at the core, this is still a fun concept, but here it just feels wrong. Like the game isn't doing what you want it to, or it isn't doing it quickly enough. Which surprisingly, shockingly, crazily, unexpectedly makes a fast-paced game not very fun to play. I think that's part of the reason why Smash 64 characters are so basic. Because, say, if you had a character with more complex movement and attacking styles, they'd probably feel horrible to play. I'm sorry, Ness. And that's really what it comes down to. While I think the core of the game is solid, this kind of stuff eats away at it, making the game feel remarkably less fun to return to. Pretty much the entire time I'm playing it, I'm thinking I should probably play one of the other ones instead, which is not a feeling I get while playing other Smash games. But while this general Clunk makes the game less fun to play, I don't think it's the sole reason no one seems to care about it anymore. I mean, plenty of N64 games have a bit of Clunk present, and yet I still hear people sing their praises all these years later, but I never see the same for 64. And I think the reason is because Smash 64 has one fundamental difference that makes it pretty much irrelevant nowadays, a difference that most of its successors don't have. While Smash as a series has always been designed as a multiplayer game first and foremost, the thing that really set it apart in cases like Melee and Brawl was their unrelenting focus on having just as much to do in single player as they do in multiplayer. These are each massive packages with their own interesting things to do, some of which are the coolest things the series, and really Nintendo as a whole, has ever done. So how about we look at what Smash 64 has to offer? First up is Classic Mode, the series' signature single-player mode that every game has some variant of. In this mode, the character has to go through a set of fights, battling different characters from the game under different contexts. Whether that be a single battle, a fight against a giant enemy, fighting Polygon Team, or an occasional minigame to break things up, everything eventually leading to a final fight against Master Hand, the puppet master behind everything. This mode is always a classic. See what I did there? Though this version of Classic Mode isn't exactly the best, partially because it never really changes. You fight the same characters on the same stages in the same order over and over for every character you play as, which kinda loses its luster pretty quickly. Besides break the targets and board the platforms having unique layouts for every character, there's nothing separating one playthrough from another. Still, it's something to do, and again, those minigames are pretty fun, so it's a serviceable single player mode. So we got Classic Mode. What's up next? Does training mode count? Yes, seriously, that's it. That's the total amount of stuff to do that isn't just straight up versus matches. One mode. A mode that, due to only having 12 characters, can be 100% completed in 3 hours. And that's it. This is a tiny amount of content, and it means that 64 really only has viability as a multiplayer game. And so, that begs a question. When your main appeal is multiplayer, and when you have nothing else to offer, what does that mean when the next game comes out, and does everything you do, but does it better? What are you then? And unfortunately for Smash 64, I think we already have our answer. The 90s was littered with fighting games, as I mentioned, but the thing that's interesting about that is looking back at what happened to their older entries once they ceased to be the newest one. Because time and time again, once these were no longer the newest entry in the series, they were left behind, set to fade into irrelevance with time. And the thing is, Smash isn't usually like this. For Melee, Brawl, heck even Smash 4, there's always something to return to. Even if the newest game has the most characters or the most stages or whatever, there will always be something unique that makes the older ones worth revisiting. It means these games remain relevant and discussed long after their debut, whether there's still a competitive community behind them or not. All of these games, except 64. In its time, 64 was a mind-blower of a game, a title that did something that seemed impossible, combining all these beloved franchises into something truly special. It had a unique style of its own, and despite the clunk befitting of its era, the game still made mountains of memories for children all across the world. But now, that time has passed, and everything 64 did has been greatly outpaced by its successors. Its character roster left looking minuscule, its mechanics left looking clunky and outdated. 64 feels like a game that's lost its purpose. That's why I've always had so much trouble talking about it in the past, and why so much of this video was spent discussing the roster and mechanics it set in place. Because outside of that, there's really nothing else to talk about with this game. Nothing of value besides starting the formula and introducing the first characters to the series. Because at the core, that's really all it is. The first Smash game. Outside of playing it for novelty, there's nothing this one has that feels unique to it. It's just a bare bones game with barely any characters, barely any stages, barely any content, barely anything. A game with nothing of its own, one that'll go down as a historical piece, a start to a massive, world-shattering franchise, and a game that's entirely worthless otherwise.